21 miles. That's all that stands between the modern world and an energy catastrophe. Not a war, not a recession, not even a government collapse. 21 miles of water. Right now, as you watch this, 20% of the world's oil supply is trapped. Insurance companies have abandoned coverage. The world's largest shipping operators have suspended their routes entirely. And in a single recent 24-hour period, just 2 ships transited a corridor that normally sees over 100 oil tankers per day. Neither of them carried oil. This is the Strait of Hormuz. And what is unfolding here is not a shipping disruption, not a regional conflict, and not a temporary price spike. This is a civilizational choke point, and it was always going to come to this. To understand why this crisis is unlike anything before it, you need to understand a geographic reality that the global economy was built on top of and chose to ignore. The Persian Gulf is not like any other body of water on Earth. Surrounding it are some of the planet's largest oil producers: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, the UAE. Together, they feed the arteries of global trade. They keep cargo ships moving. They keep factories in Asia running. They keep Europe warm through winter. But the Gulf has a fatal flaw baked into its geography. It's a dead end, a cul-de-sac, an enclosed basin with exactly one exit: the Strait of Hormuz. Unlike the Gulf of Mexico, which has multiple wide openings, multiple routes, multiple options, the Persian Gulf offers ships precisely one path in and one path out. No alternatives, no back doors, no workaround. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the strait carried an average of 20 million barrels of oil per day in 2024. That's roughly 20% of all global petroleum consumption. Add to that approximately 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas trade, primarily from Qatar, squeezing through 2 shipping lanes, each just 2 miles wide. Iran has mapped every inch of those lanes. It knows exactly which paths vessels must follow, and it knows precisely how to shut them down. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated strike campaign against Iranian targets. Iran's response was immediate. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps moved to enforce a closure of the strait. The head of the International Energy Agency, speaking from Paris, described what followed as, in his words, the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not a soundbite. That is the IEA's executive director telling the world that this event has no historical precedent. The numbers validate it. When the strikes began, Brent crude surged 13%, reaching around $80 per barrel within days. And that was before the full closure took hold. Goldman Sachs issued an emergency note to clients, estimating traders were pricing in a risk premium of $14 per barrel above the pre-war price. Their analysis calculated that a full 4-week halt in Hormuz flows could add between $10 and $15 to global oil prices. Then things kept escalating. By early April, West Texas Intermediate had climbed roughly 41% since the strikes began. Brent crude rose approximately 32%. These are not market corrections. These are markets beginning to price in the possibility that this disruption is not temporary. And then the IRGC made its position explicit. In a public statement, a spokesperson declared that any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be considered a legitimate target, and added, "Expect oil at $200 per barrel." The last time oil approached that level was 2008, and even then, it didn't reach it. Here is what most coverage is missing. Oil is the headline, but the Strait of Hormuz is carrying far more than crude. According to CNBC, approximately 1/3 of all global fertilizer trade passes through this corridor, including massive volumes of nitrogen exports from Gulf producers. And the closure didn't happen at a random moment. It happened at the edge of spring planting season in the American Midwest. Urea fertilizer prices at the New Orleans hub have already jumped from $475 per metric ton to approximately $680, a 43% spike in one of the most critical inputs for U.S. food production. If those shipments remain blocked through planting season, food inflation begins showing up on grocery shelves within months. This isn't speculation, it's a supply chain timeline. The Middle East also accounted for roughly 21% of global unwrought aluminum imports in 2025, and that share was rising. Shipping giants Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd have suspended their Middle East routes entirely. A logistics expert quoted by CNBC estimated that the real pressure hit supply chains within 2 to 5 weeks, arriving containers clustering at ports, terminal congestion rising, truck and chassis availability falling short of demand, the clothes in your store, the aluminum in your car, the plastics in your electronics, the fertilizer that grew your food. All of it runs through supply chains that loop back to 21 miles of water. This is not an inconvenience. This is a systemic shock. Europe is facing an energy crisis that may exceed what it endured in 2022 after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Heading into this crisis, European gas storage was at just 30% capacity, already depleted by a harsh 2025-2026 winter. Then on March 2nd, Iran-linked drones struck Qatari gas facilities. Qatar is Europe's single largest LNG supplier. The result, Dutch TTF gas benchmark prices nearly doubled, reaching over 60 euros per megawatt hour by mid-March. That is the threshold that triggered energy rationing discussions across the continent in 2022. The European Central Bank, which had been planning interest rate cuts, postponed those plans on March 19th. It raised its 2026 inflation forecast, cut GDP growth projections, and warned of high recession risk if the blockade persists through summer's critical gas refill season. UK inflation is projected to breach 5% this year. EU chemical and steel manufacturers have already imposed surcharges of up to 30% on their products. A European lawmaker quoted by the BBC put it plainly, different conflict. Same European divisions, same dilemmas over energy. Something's got to give. Every time a crisis like this emerges, the same question surfaces. Why can't we simply build around it? We built the Suez Canal. We carved through Panama. Human civilization has re-engineered geography before. Why not here? The answer is geography itself. And the Persian Gulf is immune to our engineering in a way that Egypt and Panama never were. The Suez was roughly 100 miles of flat desert. Panama was 50 miles of narrow isthmus. Both had logical solutions that the terrain pointed toward. The Persian Gulf is a dead end. To the north lies the Caspian Sea, landlocked, useless for ocean trade. Reaching it would require carving through Iran and the very country enforcing the closure. To the west, a canal would need to traverse Iraq, Jordan, and multiple conflict zones at a cost and timeline that defies any serious analysis. The only remotely plausible option has long been the Musandam Peninsula, a mountainous wedge of land dividing Oman and the UAE, with a narrowing that theoretically could be canaled. A 2015 study proposed an alternative coastal route at an optimistic estimate of $80 billion. Nothing materialized. Why? Because the Musandam is not flat sand. It is jagged, towering rock, some peaks exceeding 6,000 feet in one of the driest regions on Earth. A canal here would need complex lock systems that require enormous volumes of water. Current cost estimates begin at $100–200 billion, and here is the decisive point. Even if it were built, it would be just as narrow as the strait itself. Iran's missiles would reach it just as easily. You would have spent 2 centuries of effort to create a second choke point, equally vulnerable. What about pipelines? Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been routing oil through existing pipelines at maximum capacity since the closure. But Goldman Sachs calculated the ceiling precisely. All spare pipeline capacity in the region can redirect approximately 4.2 million barrels per day combined. The strait was carrying 20 million. The remaining 16 million are stranded. The IEA responded with what it called an unprecedented release: 400 million barrels from global strategic reserves. Its executive director was explicit. The most important thing is the resumption of transit through the strait. We can buy time. We cannot buy a solution. J.P. Morgan's commodities desk issued an analysis identifying the actual cliff edge in this crisis. The last tanker to clear Hormuz before the closure was expected to reach its final destination around April 20th. After that date, in J.P. Morgan's own words, pre-closure barrels are fully exhausted from the global supply chain. The world then begins drawing down strategic reserves in real time, with no incoming supply to replace what is consumed. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas published a model comparing this disruption to every major oil shock in modern history. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 removed roughly 6% of global oil supply. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 removed about 4%. The Iran-Iraq War, 4%. The Persian Gulf War, just over 6%. The current disruption represents close to 20% of global supply. That is 3 to 5 times larger than any previous geopolitical oil shock in recorded history. There are only two directions this goes. There is no middle. Path 1, a negotiated resolution within weeks. Iran and the United States reach some form of ceasefire. The risk premium bleeds out of oil prices. Ships gradually return to Hormuz lanes, possibly under U.S. Navy escort, a mechanism the Trump administration was already examining in early March. Strategic reserves buy enough time. Markets stabilize. Europe refills its gas storage. The damage is real but contained. The system holds. The condition, a diplomatic off-ramp that Iran accepts as face-saving and that Washington is willing to offer. There are signals. Back-channel communications have reportedly been underway, but diplomatic signals evaporate. And every day the strait remains closed, the economic pressure on every party, including Iran, which needs oil revenue to function, compounds. Path 2. The blockade extends into the second quarter. The April 20th deadline passes. Oil pushes toward $150, $170, potentially the IRGC's stated target of $200. The fertilizer crunch hits the northern hemisphere harvest. Europe enters recession. Central banks, caught between supply-driven inflation and slowing growth, face a policy trap unlike any they have navigated before. Bloomberg's analysis estimated that at $170 per barrel, the impact on global inflation and growth roughly doubles. A stagflationary shock capable of shifting credit markets, central bank policy, and consumer behavior across multiple continents simultaneously. This is not a replay of 2008. This is something the modern global economy has genuinely never faced. Here's the uncomfortable truth at the center of all of this. For all of humanity's engineering achievements, the canals we carved, the satellites we launched, the microchips we compressed to the width of atoms, we built the entire modern world's energy infrastructure on a single strip of water. And we built it knowing there was only one exit. The global energy transition is real. The investment in solar, wind, and battery storage is meaningful. But in 2026, the world still consumes 100 million barrels of oil per day. Solar panels do not make fertilizer. They do not fuel the cargo ships that move 90% of global trade. And until decarbonization is complete, which is a matter of decades, not years, every energy disruption on Earth runs through 21 miles of water that sits under Iranian military influence. That is the structural vulnerability the world chose to build on top of. And it is being exposed in real time right now. We will continue tracking this as it develops. Because the April 20th supply deadline is approaching, diplomatic back channels are active, and the next move in this crisis will reshape energy markets, inflation trajectories, and geopolitical alignments for years to come. If you want to understand what happens next, not just what is being reported, but what it actually means, this channel exists for exactly that purpose. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. And if this gave you context you didn't have before, share it with someone who is still treating this as background noise, because it isn't background noise. This is the loudest signal the global economy has sent in a generation. And the next chapter is still being written. We'll be here when it is.